He was halfway through a standing ovation when his smile stopped being real. The lights were blinding. The laughter rolled through the theater like a wave he couldn't escape. Charlie Chaplin, the man who built joy out of silence, stood motionless at center stage, one hand raised in gratitude, the other trembling behind his back. For 15 minutes, the crowd wouldn't stop clapping. They were seeing a legend. But behind that famous grin was a man who hadn't slept in 3 nights, who'd been called a traitor, a fraud, and worse. He'd spent his life teaching the world to laugh through pain. Now, that laughter was the only thing keeping him from breaking. The orchestra played his theme from the Tramp. He bowed once, then again. And as the curtain fell, his face didn't change, only his eyes did. Minutes later, backstage, they found him alone in the dark, still wearing the makeup, staring at the floor, whispering something no one could hear. That night would become a legend of its own. The night the man who made the world laugh forgot how. If this story reached you, where are you watching from? Drop your city below, and let's see how far legends still travel. It was spring in London. The Palladium was full. Every seat taken, every breath held in that peculiar hush before the curtain rises. Backstage, the smell of grease paint and dust hung in the air. Technicians whispered cues into headsets. A violin hummed somewhere behind the curtain, tuning to a single pure note. Outside, the streets were slick from an evening drizzle, the kind that turns every light into a reflection. It was supposed to be a celebration, a tribute to the man who had taught generations how to laugh without words. But something in the air had shifted. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The posters, the press, the red carpet glinting under flashbulbs. Inside, a quiet kind of reverence, like people arriving at a monument rather than a show. Chaplin had been living in exile for years. This was his first time back in front of an English audience in decades. To the crowd, it was nostalgia. To him, it was a test. He waited in the wings, listening to the audience settle. Every sound, the coughs, the murmurs, the slow shuffle of programs, echoed louder than it should have. He adjusted his cuffs twice, then didn't move. Everyone thought it was just another appearance, a legend returning home for one last bow. No one noticed how still he'd become between handshakes. The jokes with the crew had stopped weeks ago. Even the walk, that famous, bouncing stride, had slowed. The orchestra struck the first note of the overture. The spotlight cut through the dark, a narrow beam of gold over the empty stage. He didn't blink. From the balcony, you could feel the audience lean forward as the curtain began to rise. From backstage, you could hear the small exhale he made before stepping into the light. But something in his eyes, caught briefly in the reflection of a stage mirror, wasn't excitement. It was calculation. Like a man preparing to hold his breath. The show unfolded exactly as planned. Every movement timed, every laugh landing where it should. To the audience, he was still the master, the eternal clown, graceful in every stumble. But behind the curtain, assistants watched him differently. They'd seen the way he gripped his cane a moment too long after each scene. They'd heard the silence in his dressing room during intermission. The laughter was still loud, but the looks had changed. In the control booth, one producer muttered that the crowd sounded almost nervous. It wasn't the usual laughter, it was admiration. The kind that forgets the man inside the myth. No one knew it then, but the pressure was already building. Years of exile, suspicion, and age condensed into one final performance. Every laugh that night landed heavier than applause. It sounded like farewell. He bowed, smiled, and waved just as they remembered. But his hands didn't quite meet. His gaze never found the crowd. He thought the night would prove he still belonged, that the love of millions could drown out what came before. It looked normal, that's what made it dangerous. Because history doesn't announce when it's about to change. It just keeps rolling like a reel of film, until the frame cracks in silence. The spotlight hit before he was ready. A single white circle on the curtain. The orchestra held the final note of the overture. Then silence. The curtain rose. And there he was. Charlie Chaplin, 82 years old, standing alone in the center of the stage, facing the kind of crowd he hadn't seen in decades. For a moment, he didn't move. Only the faint buzz of the microphone filled the air. He blinked twice, steadying himself. Then slowly he smiled. The audience erupted. The sound was deafening, hundreds rising to their feet, clapping until their hands went numb. The laughter came next. Warm, familiar, desperate to fill the years that had passed. He raised his hand in a small wave. The gesture they all remembered. It broke the crowd completely. People shouted his name. Some cried. Some just stood there, trying to take in the sight of a man they thought they'd never see again. The applause went on for minutes. 5, 10. The conductor lowered his baton. Even he understood. This wasn't a concert anymore. It was history catching its breath. But something had already changed. Up close, the moment didn't look triumphant. The lights were too bright. The air too thick. He was struggling to see past the glare. From the wings, his wife watched him shift his weight. Small, cautious movement. Each bow seemed to take effort. Each smile, a fraction longer to return. Stagehands froze in place, waiting for a cue that never came. Chaplin wasn't following the script anymore. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't even pretending to. The crowd didn't notice. They were caught between nostalgia and disbelief. The man on stage was older, slower, quieter, but still him. That was enough. Until it was. He stepped forward. The microphone caught the soft scrape of his shoe against the floor. It echoed. One sound in a room full of thousands. He leaned toward the mic. Tried to speak. The first word dissolved into static. Then nothing. A technician turned up the gain, searching for his voice. Chaplin tried again. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The silence spread through the theater like fog. People leaned forward, thinking he was pausing for effect. He was. In the control booth, someone whispered, "Cut the feed." No one moved. For 12 seconds, the world waited. Then he exhaled, softly, almost invisible, and turned away from the mic. He looked to the orchestra pit, then to the side curtain, then back at the audience. The smile returned. Not wide, not real, just enough. He raised his cane in a half salute. The crowd, unsure what else to do, erupted again. It was automatic, applause as reflex. And for a few seconds it worked. It looked like a happy ending. But backstage, the sound of the cheering reached him differently. It wasn't celebration anymore. It was distance. He walked off the stage before the final cue. The curtain fell behind him, still shaking from the crowd's noise. Backstage, everything dimmed. The light changed from white to yellow. The music became muffled. He moved past crew members who didn't know whether to speak or not. Someone offered him a towel. He didn't take it. He reached the dressing room without saying a word, closed the door quietly, and the moment that had made millions laugh ended in complete silence. Inside, it was just him and the mirror. The grease paint had begun to crack at the corners of his mouth. He sat down, hands resting on his knees, breathing slow, deliberate breaths. The applause was still echoing through the walls. It sounded far away, like a memory he didn't trust. He looked at his reflection. Not the tramp, not the legend, just an old man in a suit that didn't fit right anymore. He pressed his hand against the table. It trembled slightly. Outside the door, a stagehand listened. Nothing. No words. No movement. Someone said, "Give him a minute." No one argued. In the auditorium, the applause had faded into scattered murmurs. People were leaving, still smiling, unaware that something had cracked backstage. The orchestra packed their instruments in silence. One of them said it was the most moving performance they'd ever seen. They didn't know how right they were. He stayed in that room for nearly half an hour. When the door finally opened, he looked calm. He nodded to the crew, thanked the conductor, and walked out through the side exit. Outside, the night air was cold. He pulled his coat tight. For a second, he turned back toward the theater, toward the sound of people still talking, still laughing. Then he looked down and kept walking. The cameras had stopped rolling. The show was over. But the silence that followed stayed, because what the world saw that night was a comeback. What happened behind the curtain was something else entirely. He returned to the stage once more that night. The crowd was still on its feet, every seat glowing under white light, every face tilted upward. He bowed steady this time, raised his hand in that familiar salute, part gratitude, part habit. Flashbulbs fired from the aisles, capturing the moment history had waited for. For a few seconds, it looked perfect. The sound, the rhythm, the illusion, everything aligned again. But something in him had already changed. Backstage, the energy was different. Crew members moved quickly, whispering directions, resetting lights for interviews. He sat at the edge of a leather chair, his coat draped over one arm, eyes fixed on the floor. A producer asked if he wanted to make a brief statement for the press. He nodded, slowly stood, and then stood still. No one spoke until he walked past them toward the corridor. He looked composed, but detached, like someone moving through a photograph instead of a hallway. The applause hadn't stopped, but it didn't sound the same. He reached the reception room, where champagne glasses were lined on a silver tray. Reporters, executives, and old friends surrounded him. He smiled on cue. The cameras clicked in rhythm. He said thank you several times to no one in particular. When people spoke to him, his answers came seconds late, short, polite, unfinished. He laughed once. It sounded like effort. Someone asked what it felt like to be back. He paused, as if searching for a line he used to know. "It feels familiar," he said, then turned away before anyone could ask what he meant. Outside the theater, the press called it a triumph. Chaplin returns to thunderous applause. One headline read. The photos showed the smile. None showed the moment after. Even the praise carried a faint distance. The words were kind, but careful admiration wrapped in nostalgia. Like everyone was remembering him instead of seeing him. What looked like calm was actually surrender. In the following days, he attended a series of private gatherings. Film executives, critics, and former co-stars, all eager to be near the legend again. He listened more than he spoke, occasionally nodded when people quoted his own work to him. At one dinner he left early, saying the noise made it hard to think. No one argued. They assumed he was tired. But fatigue wasn't the problem. It was something quieter, a kind of distance that had grown between him and the laughter that once defined him. He still smiled when people quoted his lines, but never at the right moments. Back home, the press requests kept arriving. Producers wanted follow-up interviews. Television hosts wanted a reunion segment. He declined most of them, said he preferred silence for now, said he needed to rest. In truth, he was trying to understand the noise, the cheers, the lights, the sudden warmth after years of cold distance. It didn't fit anymore. It felt like applause from another life. The perfection everyone saw had already started to dissolve. In private, he returned to his old habits, routines that once kept him grounded. He read scripts he'd written years earlier, watched his own films in the small screening room upstairs. Sometimes he laughed softly at the timing, at the rhythm of a gag he hadn't thought about in decades. Other times, he turned the projector off halfway through. It wasn't the work that unsettled him. It was the reflection, the sight of a younger man who still believed he could control every sound, every silence, every emotion. The man who smiled for the world and never broke character. He realized he no longer knew how to play that part. The people around him noticed the difference. He missed meetings, ignored phone calls, skipped rehearsals for upcoming appearances. Assistants said he'd walk through the house without speaking for hours. At night, he would sit by the piano, playing fragments of melodies no one recognized. He'd play one phrase again and again, until it faded into silence. The music room became his new stage, empty, controlled, predictable. Out there, the world was still clapping. In here, no one asked him to smile. The press at first called it mystery, then fatigue, then something else they couldn't quite define. He didn't respond. He'd learned that words often did more harm than silence. But silence can become its own kind of noise. And in the weeks that followed, it grew louder. At a dinner with close friends, he barely touched his food. When someone asked if he was planning to return to directing, he shook his head. "Not right now," he said. Then, after a long pause, "Maybe not again." They laughed, thinking he was joking. He didn't correct them. The room went quiet for a moment. Someone raised a glass. He smiled politely and excused himself. He said goodnight earlier than usual. No one thought much of it. But the door that closed behind him marked the beginning of something else, the quiet unraveling that always follows applause. The calls began fading within a week. One by one, scheduled interviews were postponed, then quietly canceled. The newspapers that once wrote his name in headlines began printing shorter stories, smaller photos, shorter paragraphs. It wasn't scandal, it wasn't cruelty. It was distance. But the silence was only beginning. A letter arrived from the production board, polite, formal, unsigned. It thanked him for his appearance and reminded him of pending concerns. He read it twice, folded it carefully, left it on the desk. Later that morning, a photographer waited outside the gate, camera ready. Chaplin didn't come out. He stopped walking the garden paths by then. The gravel had grown over with moss. Inside, the curtains stayed drawn. The clocks kept ticking, but no one checked them anymore. Friends visited at first. Producers, fellow actors, people who owed him everything. They stayed for tea, spoke softly, avoided questions. By the third visit, most stopped coming. He didn't chase them. He stopped answering letters too. Stacks began to form on his writing table. Invitations, scripts, requests for signatures. None were opened. The housekeeper once said the piano stayed untouched for months. The lid gathered dust in perfect lines. What looked like calm was withdrawal. Reporters kept trying. They waited outside the gate, hoping for a quote, a glimpse, a reason. Every day, fewer returned. By winter, the cameras had stopped showing up entirely. The public assumed he was resting. The industry called it retirement. Inside the house, it was something quieter. He moved less, spoke less, waited more. Meals arrived on time, but half remained untouched. He slept through most afternoons, waking only when the mail arrived, then leaving it unopened. But something was changing beneath that silence. Old films began airing again. Television reruns, late-night specials. For the first time, people saw his face without his voice, without the context of new work to follow. Clips circulated. The laughter returned, but it sounded different now. It belonged to the past. He watched one broadcast in his study. No expression, no movement, just the flicker of black and white light on his face. Then he turned the television off. Letters from abroad began arriving, fans from places he'd never been, thanking him, asking for autographs. He signed a few, then stopped again. The routine was gone. No more rehearsals, no more scripts, no more stages to prepare for. The days began to blur. He'd walk the hallways late at night, barefoot on the cold floor. Sometimes he'd stop at the window, overlooking the hills. The lights of other houses blinked faintly in the distance. He watched them for a long time, then turned away. The industry moved on. New stars filled the screens. New stories replaced his. One magazine ran a feature titled "The Last Laugh." It was respectful, distant, final. The article said he'd retired gracefully. They didn't mention the empty dressing rooms or the phone lines that no longer rang. He didn't respond. He didn't correct them. He simply stopped being part of the noise. Weeks passed, then months. The world kept clapping for other people. He watched from a distance that kept growing. Occasionally, the housekeeper would find him sitting by the window at dawn, staring out at the fog. He'd stay there until the light changed, then quietly return to his chair. He no longer rehearsed anything. Not words, not gestures, not appearances. The performance was over, even if no one had said it out loud. And that was enough. One evening, a telegram arrived from an old friend in America. It said a festival wanted to screen his films again. He read it, smiled faintly, set it aside. He didn't send a reply. The world was offering him its stage again, but the stage no longer mattered. He'd already stepped off it once, and found there was nothing waiting on the other side but quiet. The quiet stayed. By now, the staff had grown used to the rhythm. Closed doors, long silences, a slow walk through the garden in the mornings. He still wore a suit every day, still combed his hair, polished his shoes. He didn't look unwell, just still. The air inside the house had a kind of steady weight, the kind that comes when nothing interrupts it anymore. Even the clock seemed to tick slower. But the silence had stopped feeling empty. It was simply there. Occasionally, he'd receive a letter addressed only to Charlie. No surname, no return address. He kept those, stacked neatly in the drawer beside the piano. He never read them all the way through. He didn't need to. He understood what they said, that people still cared, even if he no longer needed them to. He no longer spoke of the night on stage, not to his family, not to his staff. It was as if it belonged to someone else now. The newspapers had archived it. The reels had stopped replaying it. But for him, it never really ended. It just dissolved into the background, the way sound fades when the film runs out. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He just stopped showing up. By the time the final photograph was taken, he looked content, still, composed, surrounded by the quiet he'd once feared. The world had moved on, but the silence stayed. And for a man who'd spent a lifetime mastering the sound of laughter, it was the first time the silence finally made sense. The house stayed quiet. Reporters moved on. The phone lines that once rang without pause had gone still. He woke early, the same time every morning, walked through the garden before breakfast, paused by the old stone bench near the pond, the one he'd chosen years earlier for thinking, not resting. The air carried the same soft chill each day. Birds in the orchard, a gardener trimming the hedges without speaking. Nothing new, nothing missing. For the first time in years, time itself seemed to slow down. He stopped writing, stopped rehearsing. The notebooks on his desk stayed closed, their corners slightly curled from the light. Each afternoon, he'd sit by the window and watch the fog roll across the hills. Sometimes he'd hum under his breath, half melodies from old scores, fragments of films no one remembered. It wasn't nostalgia. It was habit, a quiet routine that asked for nothing and promised nothing. But history wasn't finished with him yet. By the late years, the world had begun to look back. Old reels resurfaced on television, clips from The Kid, City Lights, Modern Times. Audiences who had never seen him before laughed again, not out of memory, but discovery. Newspapers printed retrospectives. Critics called him timeless, the same word they once used to erase him. He didn't respond to any of it, didn't issue statements, didn't attend screenings. He simply let the noise pass through the years until it softened again. The silence had one last thing to say. The invitations began arriving slowly. Film institutes, academies, festivals, polite letters asking him to return, to be honored, to be seen. He declined most of them, until one came from the same country that had exiled him decades earlier. America. The letter was simple. It invited him to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award. He read it once, then set it down. For several days, it stayed on the table untouched. Then he agreed, quietly. When the night finally came, it had been more than 20 years since he'd set foot there. He was older now, smaller, slower. The tuxedo needed tailoring, the cane polishing. He entered the auditorium as the orchestra played his theme. People stood before he even reached the stage. The applause began early and didn't stop. For 12 minutes, the room wouldn't quiet down. Not out of spectacle, out of relief. It wasn't a celebration. It was recognition that time had caught up. He stood there, head bowed slightly, hands trembling on the cane. Then he smiled. Just once. And in that moment, the years in between disappeared. Back home, the award sat on the mantel beside a small clock that no longer kept time. He didn't move it. Didn't talk about the ceremony. The next morning, he walked his usual route through the garden. Stopped by the pond again. Watched the reflection of the trees ripple across the water. Nothing looked different, but everything had changed. What they forgot, time remembered. In the years that followed, the house stayed quiet but not empty. Children, grandchildren, visitors, the sound of new voices filling old rooms. He spoke less, listened more. When people asked about his films, he deflected with small jokes. When they asked about his past, he changed the subject. He stopped defending the story long ago. He'd started living inside it. Some afternoons, he'd fall asleep by the window, sunlight crossing his face like a soft filter over old film. The world outside had moved forward, color, sound, new stars, but the laughter that built his life was still echoing somewhere beyond reach. He didn't chase it anymore. By the final years, the garden had overgrown slightly. vines curling over the stone walls, roses untamed. He didn't mind. He liked it that way. Each morning he sat by the piano but rarely played. When he did, it was one or two notes, short, careful, incomplete. He'd pause between them, as if waiting for silence to answer. No cameras, no audiences, just the rhythm of a life that had finally slowed enough to match his own. The noise that once followed him everywhere had dissolved into something quieter, a kind of stillness that needed no applause. On his last Christmas, the family gathered at the house. Laughter filled the rooms again. Children ran down the hallways where spotlights used to hang. He watched from his chair, smiling at the sound. The laughter was different now, lighter, unperformed. He said very little, but his eyes stayed fixed on the scene as if it were his last audience. Later that night, the house fell silent again. The candles burned low. Snow began to fall outside. He passed in his sleep before dawn. By morning, the garden was covered in white. The pond frozen still. The paths he'd walked every day disappeared under snow. The world woke to the news quietly. Headlines printed his name once more. No controversies, no debate, just a date, a photograph, and the word goodbye. He was gone, but the sound he left behind, the laughter, the silence between it, never really faded. They called him a genius, then dangerous, then forgotten. But time corrected all of it. What remained wasn't the myth or the mistake. It was the moment he gave the world permission to laugh through pain, even when he couldn't. The lake outside his window never changed. The reels keep turning. The lights still fade to black the same way they always did. And somewhere in that flicker between frames, Charlie Chaplin is still smiling,